Welcome to the Hank Haney Podcast here on nofilter.net. You can see the Hank Haney Podcast on nofilter.net and on YouTube on the Hank Haney Podcast channel. And you can hear the Hank Haney Podcast on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcast. The podcast today is brought to you by, as usual, haneyuniversity.com. That is my website. That is where you can go to find out information. If you are inclined to get better at your golf game, you can do that by either signing up for my free instructional videos that go out on a weekly basis, or you can also find out information on golf lessons from me. And I am currently teaching in Highland Park, Illinois at the Golf Practice, great practice facility, and really enjoying the teaching. I get a lot of great students, and most of them listen to the podcast. So I appreciate everybody listening. The podcast today is also brought to you by Bet Online, which is your number one source for the NBA Finals and Stanley Cup playoffs this season. You get every stat, every matchup, even live odds and spreads while the games are being played. When the game's over, head over to our online casino and you can get in on a game of blackjack or poker or unwind on one of our 150 slot games. Head to the website today so you can get in on the action and use the promo code BLEAV and you get a 50% bonus on your first deposit. Bet Online, it's where the game starts. Go to betonline.ag. All right, I was given a lesson today, and it dawned on me how much the game of golf has changed in many, many different ways. But I thought, I need to talk about this. And then I started giving a little story to one of my students, and I told him a story about Ben Hogan. And I thought, I've got a couple Ben Hogan stories. Ben Hogan was one of the most iconic golfers in the history of the game of golf, one of the greatest golfers in the history of golf. Of course, he was from Texas, and I lived in Texas for 29 years. Ben Hogan, a member of the Texas Golf Hall of Fame, and of course, the World Golf Hall of Fame. I actually happen to be a member of the Texas Golf Hall of Fame, too. So that's one of the great honors in my life. But anyway, I was thinking about how much the world of golf, professional golf, has changed. I remember when I first started coaching Mark O'Meara, and Mark was a player who didn't really know anything about the golf swing when I started helping him, and then he turned out to be one of the great students of the golf swing. But I remember when I met him at Pinehurst Hotel and Country Club, and he was hooking the golf ball. And back in the day, you kind of had to hook the golf ball to get the spin off the ball. Of course, that's changed now with all the equipment. The ball just doesn't spin as much. But Mark hated that hook because sometimes the hook got too big, and he said, "I just want to fade the ball. I want to fade the ball. I want to fade the ball." And I said, why don't we help you learn to draw it correctly so it doesn't hook too much? That was my suggestion. Of course, he was open for anything. But that's one of the things that has changed a lot in the game today. A lot of players are playing a fade, and especially off the tee. Another thing that's changed is obviously the speed of the greens and the firmness of the greens. And the U.S. Open's coming up at Pinehurst, and that's where I met Mark O'Meara. So I got great memories there. But Pinehurst is open in the front. You can kind of bounce the ball in, and nowadays you typically have to hit a little higher shot, usually a much higher shot to hold the greens because the greens are faster and they're firmer. The pin placements are more difficult today on the PGA Tour. It used to be, there'd be 7, 8, 9 from the edge of the green. Now the pin placements are 3 or 4 from the edge of the green. It's just a much different game, and it's reflected in the ball flight that pros are using and the way that they're they're flighting the golf ball. And I thought about this because one of my students was hitting a particularly low shot, and I said we got to get that ball up in the air. And they even brought up that a lot of the great my student told me, he said I went to one of the tournaments. He said it was years back. It was a match play tournament in Tucson, and it used to be called the Accenture Match Play. And he said I watched Rory McIlroy. He said I couldn't believe how high he hit the golf ball. Well, Rory McIlroy hits it very high. Jack Nicklaus hit it high. Tiger Woods hit it high. Greg Norman hit it high. I mean, the dominant players have been high ball. Tom Watson hit it high. The dominant players have been high hitters. I mean, they hit the ball up in the air. But back in the day, the greens were slower, much slower. So the greens would hold better because they were slower. And a lot of times you wanted to hit the ball down. And it reminded me of a story when Mark O'Meara and I first met. Mark was with the Ben Hogan Company. It was like his second year on the tour, and he represented the Ben Hogan Company. Matter of fact, Mark turned pro in Mr. Hogan's office in Fort Worth, Texas. And there was a couple stories, Ben Hogan stories. And I always studied Ben Hogan as a young teacher. I loved his book, the Fundamentals of Golf, the modern fundamentals of golf. 5 lessons. I thought that was a great book. I always thought it was kind of a little bit mistitled. I kind of thought it should have been titled How Not to Hook by Ben Hogan, because of course Hogan was a terrible duck hooker. And a lot of the information in the book, although it's great and the illustrations are the greatest illustrations that have ever been in a golf book, but a lot of the information was kind of what Hogan thought about. And he hooked the golf ball, and most people who play golf slice. I'm not sure how much that book really helped people because they had an opposite ball flight mistake. But it was a great learning tool for me. I studied that book and still admire that book and I love it. But Mark told me a couple stories of times when he was with Ben Hogan. And I think one of the first times was when he went into Mr. Hogan's office, and Mr. Hogan looked at Mark's clubs, and he pulled off his head cover. This was a great story, and he said, and Mark had a baffler in there. If you know, this is an old club back in the day, and it had rails on the bottom, and it was great it was a Cobra baffler. A lot of pros got into these clubs and liked them when they first came out. And it was good for hitting off the tight lies. You could get the ball up in the air and it would send that thing up in the air, which is different than today's equipment. Today's equipment is the fairway woods are really difficult to get up in the air. And that's why a lot of pros are using 5 woods and 7 woods to get it up in the air. But anyway, Mark had this baffler. And Hogan pulled off his head. Mark told me this story. Mr. Hogan pulled off his head cover and he looked at Mark and he goes, "What the fuck is this?" And Mark looked at me. He said, "Mr. Hogan, that's a baffler." He said, "It's great for getting the ball up in the air. You can hit it off any line. You can hit it like straight up in the air." And Hogan looked at him and he said, "Mark," he said, "let me tell you something." He said, "When you're choking down the stretch, you don't want that thing up in the air. You want that thing down near the ground. Get this piece of shit out of your bag and stick a 1-iron in there." That's what Mark told me, Ben Hogan. And of course, Mark looked at him. He said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Hogan." And that baffler was out of the bag the next week, and in there was a 1-iron. And now you think about how the equipment is today. Nobody carries a 1-iron. And I was having this discussion with my student. You look at today's equipment, because the student I was teaching was 83 years old. And he said, "Can you help me hit my 4-iron?" And I'm like, "Your 4-iron? What are you going to do what are you doing with a 4-iron?" And I explained to him that a 4, and he said, "Well, I used to hit a 2-iron. This is, quite a few years ago." And I said, "Well, your 4-iron today, what is the same as what your 2-iron was back in the day. At least it's a strong 3, because the lofts have changed so much." I said, you don't need a 4-iron. I said, you need a club you can get up in the air. You want to be able to get the ball up in the air, because if you can't get the ball up in the air, he had a little cut to the right, and if you can't get the ball up in the air, you have no chance to fix a shot to the right, because a low shot to the right is really unfixable. Because if you square the club face, you're going to hit the ball even lower. So if you're already hitting it too low, you've got nothing to work with. So you have to get the ball up there. I encouraged him to, use a hybrid, use a 5-wood, a 7-wood. And again, it's the same student asked me about hitting his 3-wood, and I'm like, you don't even need a 3-wood. Use your 5-wood off the fairway. Use your 7-wood off the fairway. Your 3-wood should be a club that you use off of the tee if a driver will go too far, or on a par 3 where a driver's too much. Use your 3-wood. That's a club you'd use off the tee, and this goes for most people who play golf. But that's how much the game has changed. Hogan told Mark, get a 1-iron in your bag, and that will that'll help you under pressure. Keep the ball down, keep the ball low, and a good tip for back in the day, but not one that would be maybe used as much today, because the courses are different. The game is different. Another story Mark told me about Ben Hogan, what was when he asked him a swing question. And Hogan was famous for not answering swing questions from anybody unless you were on his staff. And there's a famous a story about Gary Player, who was a student of the game and still is. And he met Mr. Hogan one time, and he asked him a question. Said, Mr. Hogan, could I ask you a question about the swing? And Hogan looked at him and he said, who do you represent? And at the time, I think Gary Player represented Dunlop. Okay, it was a golf company back in the day. And Hogan looked at him and he said, why don't you go ask Mr. Dunlop? And needless to say, he didn't answer his question. But when Mark asked him a question, he answered it. And this is a great question. It's one that I use as an explanation for people a lot of times, because most people slice the golf ball. And when you slice the golf ball, your club face is open relative to the path of your swing. Now, what that means is your path is the direction your club is swinging. So on a launch monitor, a TrackMan, a Foresight, whatever, 0.0 would be swinging straight through at impact. If your club face is open or pointed to the right and you're swinging straight through, and let's say your club face was 2 degrees open at impact, then your club face is 2 degrees open relative to the path of the swing, because the path is straight through. Anytime your club face is open, your ball is going to curve to the right. If the club face is open relative to the path of the swing, ball is going to curve to the right. I'll give you another example. Let's say you were swinging 2 degrees to the left of your target. So you're swinging across the ball to the left, and you're swinging 2 degrees to the left. And let's say your club face is closed a little bit at impact. So at impact, it's pointed 1 degree to the left. That means your club face is 1 degree open relative to the path of the swing, because the path is 2 degrees left, but the face is only 1 degree left. So the club face is open relative to the path. Anytime the club face is open, your ball is going to curve to the right. Here's another example. This is an example of hooking the ball. Let's say you swing the club 3 degrees from end out, meaning you're swinging out towards right field if you're a right-handed golfer, and you swing 3 degrees to the right. And let's say your club face is 1 degree open. When the club face is 1 degree open at impact, and the path is 3 degrees to the right, the club face is 2 degrees closed relative to the path of the swing. Ball's going to hook every single time. So when Mark was talking about drawing the golf ball, and he went into Mr. Hogan's office and he told him, I'm trying to hit a correct draw. And Hogan said, that's good. That's what you want to try and do. That's a basic shot you got to work off of. And then you go from there to fading it and hitting all the different shots. But first thing is you got to be able to hit a correct draw. And Mark said to him, he said, and the question was precipitated because a lot of times when you read stuff, people say, you want to close the club face to hit a draw or a hook. And in actuality, when you hit a draw, you really want to have the face open. You want to have the face open, but the path going more to the right than the club face is, so that you can start the ball off to the right. Because your draws, you want to start off to the right, and you want to draw them back to the target line, not past the target line, because you're trying to be able to hit a ball in the middle of the green and work it to the pin without missing on the short side. If the pin's on the left side of the green, start the ball at the middle of the green, work it to the pin, but don't overhook it or pull it, because you don't want to miss on the short side where you got a difficult up and in. So that's how you hit it correct. A lot of times people say close the face to hit a hook. That's actually not the case, and I knew it not to be the case. But I explained this to Mark, and it was a little counterintuitive. And you read things that people say, and they say close. You want the face closed to hit a hook. It's closed relative to the path. So anyway, Mark asked Mr. Hogan. He said, "Mr. Hogan, could I ask you a question?" Of course, Hogan said yes, because Mark was on his staff. And Mark said to him, he said, the draw you just described, the ball starting to the right and drawing back to the left. He said, when you hit that shot, should your club face be open, or should it be square, or should it be a little closed? And Hogan looked at him. Mark told me the story. He said, Hogan looked at him and he said, who told you to ask that question? And of course, Mark said, well, I'm working with this young instructor named Hank Haney. I was young at the time. This is a long time ago. This is back to like probably 1980, maybe 1981, something like that. And Mark said, I'm working with this young instructor named Hank Haney. And he told me to ask that question. And Hogan looked at him and he said to Mark, he said, you tell him he's right. And that was all he said. He said, you tell him he's right. And I always knew that I was right. I always understood the real ball flight laws and what caused the golf ball to fly in a certain direction and what caused it to curve. Even when it wasn't explained that way by a lot of people, I knew I had that figured out. And today it's all still the same. But that was a great. I met Hogan one time in my life. At the Shady Oaks Country Club in Fort Worth, Texas, and it was pretty cool. The pro there was Mike Wright, and he knew Mr. Hogan very well, and he said, if you'll come over sometime, I'll introduce you to Ben Hogan. And I thought, wow, this is what I just want to say I met Ben Hogan, and we went in there. And he was playing cards. He sat at this table every day eating lunch and playing cards. And Mike found the right time, and he said, "Okay, we're going to go in there, and you're gonna get to meet Ben Hogan." And we came in, and I didn't ask him a question because I thought, well, first off, I just wanted to meet him, and thank him for everything he did for the game of golf, and tell him how much he had inspired me in my teaching. And I thought, I'm not going to ask him a question, because if I know enough to ask an intelligent question, then I probably know enough to figure out the answer for myself. But I cherished that meeting with Ben Hogan. And it was something I'll remember my whole life. And I've got one other Ben Hogan story that I'm gonna share with you. That this was one of the highlights of my coaching career. In the mid '80s, I was the director of golf, the first director of golf at Sweetwater Country Club in Houston, and I had a fella come down for a lesson one day, and he was from Fort Worth. And I said to him, how'd you decide to come down here for a lesson? You play at Shady Oaks. He said, that's where he told me he played. He said, I played Shady Oaks up in Fort Worth. I said, why'd you come down? Why'd you decide to come down here for a lesson? He said, I've got a guy I know up at the club, and he told me there's a guy down there in Houston that really knows something about the golf game and the golf swing, and you ought to go get a lesson from him. And I looked at the guy and I said, what was your friend's name? And he goes, Ben Hogan. And I thought, wow, that was one of the most, for sure, one of the most memorable moments in my career. And this is something like 40 40 years ago, and I still pinch myself to know that one story right there actually happened to me. I don't know what inspired me to tell my Ben Hogan stories today, but I hope you enjoyed them. There's some good ones, and I got a couple more. I'll share maybe another time, but those are the ones for today. Hope everybody enjoyed the podcast. Remember, if you have arthritis pain, you need to try the Voodoo Pain Relief Cream. Go to voodoopainrelief.com and you can check it out. It's 100% guaranteed. It is my product, and it is a phenomenal product. Great, great product, and it will help you out tremendously, tremendously. So go there and check it out. The Hank Haney Podcast is brought to you by Bet Online. It's your number one source for the NBA Finals and Stanley Cup playoffs this season. Every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads while the games are being played. When the game's over, head over to the online casino and get in on a game of blackjack or poker, or unwind with one of our 150 slot games. Head to the website today to get in on the action. Use the promo code BLEAV for your 50% bonus on your first deposit. Bet Online, where the game starts. Go to betonline.ag. And remember to catch the Hank Haney Podcast on nofilter.net or on the YouTube channel, the Hank Haney Podcast YouTube channel. And you can hear the Hank Haney Podcast on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts. I hope everybody has a great day, and we will talk to you soon on the Hank Haney Podcast.